This webinar is produced by West Sussex Mind with a view to supporting parents and carers whose child or young person is self-harming. Despite the intention being to support you, due to the content of the webinar, you may well find that some of it is distressing. If you do notice you're getting upset or you're noticing the early warning signs of a stress reaction, please do pause the webinar, take a break, and do an activity that helps make you feel calmer again. It's completely normal when we're learning about a topic like self-harm, even when we don't expect it to be activated by the content. It may remind you of somebody you know if you're not actually watching it because you know somebody who's self-harming currently, or it might suddenly bring up emotions that you've been trying to repress. So please do look after yourselves. So what will we cover in this webinar? Well, firstly, we'll be looking at types of self-harm and how it can manifest in a young person, possible reasons for self-harming, and what motivates people to self-harm and then to sometimes repeat that self-harm behavior, how we can support you with looking after your own reactions and your own well-being when you are supporting somebody, supporting your child or young person directly and indirectly, and signposting yourself and your young people to other support. We'll start by talking about what self-harm is. Many organisations define self-harm as self-injury, regardless of motivation, which causes damage to the body tissue. Examples of this might be cutting with a sharp implement, self-flagellation or self-strangulation, burning, taking an overdose, swallowing an object or a poison, inserting objects into the body, scratching, picking, hitting, bruising the skin, biting, hair pulling, which might be the main head of hair, or it might be eyebrows or eyelashes or hair on the body, and head banging. There are also examples of non-injurious self-harm, which might be seen as harmful behaviours, which we don't cover today, but we will mention, for example, disordered eating, misusing substances, or over-exercising, because some of the reasons behind those behaviours might be similar to the ones we discussed today. And just to bust some myths about self-harm, we're reducing the narrative using words like attention-seeking or copycatting, or that it's deliberate. Although some institutions do define self-harm as DSH, deliberate self-harm, we veer away from using this word with young people because it infers that they have full control and that it's fully their responsibility and that they're doing it on purpose, whereas many young people don't feel like they are really in control of what they're doing. Some of the things we would describe it as, for example, a form of communication of something that's very difficult to express, or maybe an intolerable emotional experience, or a memory of some kind, and that it's a coping strategy to manage those intolerable feelings, and that it's different for everybody, so every individual might take a different path for their recovery. One of the most common questions that parents and carers understandably ask is, why is my child self-harming? So there could be a number of reasons, and it does tend to vary from individual to individual, but these are some of the reasons why young people tell us they self-harm. So one of them might be that they are struggling with an emotional health problem. It might be that they're experiencing short or long-term high anxiety or very persistent low mood, or they may have been diagnosed with an emotional health condition. If somebody is questioning their identity, they might be at higher risk of self-harm. We know that LGBTQ+ young people are one of the highest risk groups. Somebody could also just be wondering how they fit in with their peer group, or who they are as a person, or what their future holds. Any of these things could cause emotional distress in a young person. Another thing to consider is lifestyle. So we know that people who misuse substances are at higher risk of self-harm. It also could be that they're going through a period of a lot of stress. Maybe they've got a lot on and their routine is really difficult to sustain. Maybe they're very tired. They might be very isolated for a while. Following the pandemic, studies showed that there were far more instances of self-harm in young people, and it's thought that this is linked to the isolation, the unpredictable routine, the fear that was attached to the pandemic. Another very important category of causes of self-harm is relationships. So be that in a couple or in a friendship group, with staff at school, with people at home or wider family. If there's conflict or feeling of disconnect, or if there's a rupture in the relationship, if there's a loss of any kind or a bereavement, then any of these things can cause emotional distress and possibly self-harm. If a young person is feeling particularly under pressure for a while, be that because of academic pressures or work pressures, very important deadlines that are coming up, or maybe they just feel that there's a lot of expectations on them, or that they have self-generated high expectations of themselves, it might lead to perfectionism or a constant feeling that they're not achieving enough, and lead to some self-worth problems or low self-esteem. So any of these examples could be considered adverse childhood experiences. There is also a formal list of ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, which can sometimes lead to traumatic impact on a young person, especially if it's happened in the early years of the childhood. And that could be witnessing abuse or being a victim of abuse, experiencing bullying at school, for example, and there are other examples as well that you'll see if you look up ACEs. Also, might be worth looking at how physically well the young person is, if they've been experiencing chronic physical health problems, maybe pain, ongoing pain, or they've had a lot of hospital admissions or interventions, or whether they have a condition like ASC. We know that autistic people are at much higher risk of self-harm, but ADHDers possibly as well. So I mentioned earlier that self-harm is a kind of coping strategy. So we're going to discuss a little bit more how self-harm might alleviate some of the struggle that might be associated with some of these examples. So it's thought that self-harm can help people express some of the things that they don't know how to talk about. Maybe they don't have the emotional literacy to describe their emotional distress, or they don't possibly know why they feel the way they do. It might be a way of venting really difficult urges like rage or frustration. It may be a way of distracting themselves from unsolvable problems or difficult memories or a fear about the future. It might be a way of converting emotional pain into physical pain that young people sometimes feel gives them more control and more agency over how they can take the next steps to resolve that issue. It also is thought to release hormones from the brain which give relief and painkillers to the body, so that the person actually feels more relaxed for a short while after the injury. It might be a way of punishing themselves because of the low feelings of self-worth that they have. It might also be a subconscious way of asking for help and eliciting care from others. It's very unlikely that this is fully conscious, intentional, or manipulative. It might be a way of indicating that there are other issues for this young person that they might not be aware of themselves, or it might be a way of them opening up that conversation with other people. Though we do know that self-harm tends to stay secret for quite some time before a person shows it to somebody or before they talk about it. What we'd like to do now is focus on you, the parents and carers. So one of the most common and understandable responses is to focus all the care and attention on the young person who is self-harming. But actually, what we really do know is very important is the well-being of the people around them, primarily the parent and carers who are supporting them. So this is a moment just to take stock of how you're doing and how you can maintain your support for your young person and look after yourselves at the same time. So first of all, we would like to mention the issue of natural guilt that tends to come up when our young person or child is struggling. So one of the most natural responses is that we think it's all our fault. It must be something that we've done, the family has done, there's something wrong with our family, and that's why our young person is harming. We would really like to acknowledge that, but also to say that it really isn't anyone's fault. No matter what has happened, it's not anyone's fault that somebody is harming themselves. And it's really important to try and reduce that guilt. The other thing that people might want to automatically do is to take control of the situation, to rescue the young person, and to stop them from ever doing anything like that again. And depending on the level of risk of the self-harming, because it can vary so much from some scratches to the skin to really, really serious injuries that might mean even a visit to A&E. So within that scale of low risk to high risk, it really does depend on how much we need to take control over what's happening. But one of the things that young people tell us is when people swoop in and try and scoop them up and control the whole thing, they don't tend to feel very empowered by that. And sometimes it can stop them from maintaining contact and keeping up that support because they don't feel that they're participating enough in the process. So for you, please know that going in and rescuing or fixing the situation or feeling horribly guilty is perfectly normal and not something to feel even more bad about. We know that when we have a shock or we have some really bad news or we have a stress that hits us in the middle of the day or when we weren't expecting something, that there are significant responses in the brain which can mean that our thinking and our processing can be at least slowed down and sometimes be very hard to access at all. In that situation, we're likely to go into fight mode, flight mode, might be that we go into freeze or something called flop when we feel very down, or we might go into what we call friendship or fawn response. It's when we try and really befriend the person who we are shocked by or even frightened of, and we might then try and appease them and try and really befriend them. Any of those strategies are really sophisticated reactions to a stressful environment, and it's a way of seeking to find safety again. And it's great if we can really take stock before we knock. So that phrase is to help us remember that we need to know how we're feeling and how we're reacting, and to clear that before we can really be there in the most useful way to support somebody who's themselves distressed. So please take time to notice how you're reacting and then to clear that and to ground yourself before you really do start to make a plan with a young person. Some of that might be telling them that you need some time to think it through. And of course, that depends on the level of risk in the situation. We mentioned self-care at the beginning of the webinar because it's very important that we notice how we're doing, if we're having a stress reaction, if our own distress is increasing, and to take time out from that environment and to actually look after ourselves, be that with grounding techniques or activities that we find relaxing, spending time with people we feel really comfortable with, talking it through with people, doing things like just going for a walk or having some breaks from things, just so that we know that we have a bit of balance for ourselves. The other thing is to really encourage people to get a team around them as well. So parents and carers supporting young people with self-harming do really need their own team. So that might be that they meet other parents and carers through organisations that are set up for that. and we'll signpost you to those organisations at the end of the webinar. It might be that you have some really trusted friends or other people in the family that you know you can talk to. It's really important that the young person does know who else knows about their personal situation. So it's important that we get consent or explain why we do need to tell other people, be that to safeguard them or so that you have support yourselves so that you can actually maintain the situation and that you don't end up feeling really distressed yourself. A very common question that parents and carers ask is whether they could be given some kind of script that they could read from or remember to say when they're talking to somebody about self-harm, because they're very worried, understandably, about making a mistake, saying the wrong thing. So just to reassure you, it's okay to repair something that we've said when we know it came from a stress place and it might not have been helpful. Just to help you maybe prepare for a conversation that you know you're going to have, it's just really important to just think about communication as a listening as well as maybe speaking or showing exchange. So sometimes it helps to create a context where we're not having to sit opposite somebody and looking straight at them looking at us to have the conversation. So maybe if you're going for a walk or you're in the car or you're side by side doing something together, that might be a better opportunity, because young people express that sometimes they don't feel quite so, in inverted commas, interrogated by somebody when they're not opposite them and they don't have to look at them. So sentence starters might help. So there's a few here. So one of them might be, I've noticed, or I've been wondering, it seems like, rather than asking direct questions. So then we might suggest that they might be struggling, or we've noticed even injuries on their arms, or whatever it is that we're going to say to them that we've seen. For them then to maybe add to that, or maybe to correct us. And it might be easier than asking direct questions. It's also probably not the best idea at this early stage to ask why they are behaving in that particular way or why they're self-harming themselves, because they may not know and they might find that a judgmental question. It's okay to say that there's something, if they want to talk through, and it's okay to introduce that, and it's a great idea to maybe tell them that it's okay for them to say something to us, and it might not be straight away that they choose to do that. Some young people disclose self-harm by giving us hints and leaving things that then might show us that there's something going on. Might be a good idea to say that they're really important and that their safety is important, that we're there for them. And also it's really important to say that we're not going to be angry and they're not in trouble. It's also important maybe just to remind the young person that, we really don't want to judge them, and that even if we say something that they feel judged by, that's not really what's underneath it. We're just worried about them. And if they're finding things difficult to manage, that we want to be there for them alongside, making a plan together. It's really important as well, even in a family relationship, to almost promise to uphold their rights to privacy by saying, if I need to talk to somebody, I will let you know. Some young people come to us and say that they didn't know that a family member was going to tell another family member, or they didn't know they were going to tell the school, and that put them off talking to them again. And it might have been that that was absolutely necessary, and with high risk it might be really difficult to uphold someone's consent for something, and we might have to tell them that. But as long as we let them know, they're more likely to trust us, to come and talk to us and maintain an interaction around what's happening in the plan next, because they're going to know that they'll hear from us if we have to make a decision that maybe they can't be involved in. Obviously, it's ideal to involve them in decisions about who to tell and when to tell them, whether they're going to be there as well, and that might give them a little bit more of their power back. So just to go through some strategies that might be helpful to go through with your child or young person, there are different types of approaches to reduce or stop self-harming. And as we mentioned earlier, if the risk is containable, then it's really ideal to get the child, young person on board around their goals and their objectives within their safety plan, and to organise with them, agree with them what the timeframes are for all the strategies that they're going to try. And it's really good at that point as well to set those boundaries for them and for you around what you can do and what you can't do and when. So one type of category of strategies for stopping or reducing self-harm is distraction. So there are lots of examples of these through the web links that we've got at the end of the webinar. Just to give you a few ideas, they might be, for example, physical distraction techniques. So they might emulate the actual physical behavior of the harming. So, for example, if it's pushing something into the skin and causing bruising, we try and distract from the skin onto another item. So, for example, using wax crayons to really push into paper, and that can be quite a cathartic physical activity for moving the behavior from the body onto the paper. And if it's pulling action, like pulling hair, for example, could possibly encourage a young person to tie some exercise stretchy bands to something secure on the wall or a door and pull against those instead. For example, headbanging. There have been some strategies set up in schools where there's an area in a quiet room where there are cushions against the wall or pillows that they can scream into or punch instead. Other things could be that, for example, some people develop physical strategies like running on the spot or hopping from one foot to the other, things like wall push-ups, or if they've got the opportunity to actually go for a run, and help alleviate the frustration and the urges that way. Another type of distraction approach is creative distractions. So some young people have found they can reduce their harming or stop their harming by increasing their creative expression. So, for example, through poetry or journaling or creative writing or music, be that listening to music or playing music or singing. And it could be through art. So, for example, through collage or clay modeling, things like that. So it's worth exploring a different technique over time to test and see if it might help, though it might take a little bit of practice. Another type of strategy is the delay approach. So rather than changing the behavior and replacing the harming with something else, it's a way of delaying the urge. So we call it sometimes surf the urge. So for example, someone might, if they're using implements, put them in a box, sellotape the box up and actually put it right out of the way, or put on top of the implements other ways of expressing their distress. So maybe that notebook or that modeling clay, and actually doing that first. Because you know, if we can buy a couple of minutes, it can really reduce the intensity of the harming or even stop the harming from happening. Another thing that people can do is have a favorite song that they play, or they start reading something, like they have something ready that they can read, even if it's the label on a bottle of sauce, that they start using their cognition to say something out loud or to read it silently to interrupt the emotional reaction. There are lots of techniques that also signposted from the links at the end. Other examples of things like saying something in a different language, spelling their name backwards and things like that, just to buy a little bit of time. Another strategy is reducing the risk. So that might be around reducing the possibility of having a wound infected. So, for example, by teaching somebody how to clean a wound, how to dress a wound, be that a cut or a burn or something like that. It might be by talking through practical approaches. So, not drinking alcohol or taking substances in certain situations if that's a typical trigger for that harming behavior. Or, for example, washing implements, not sharing implements, noticing the early warning signs of things, which we'll talk about in a minute. It might be that somebody keeps a diary of the things that happened before they're harming, so that they can also reduce the risk of that happening again. And this leads into the next one, which is triggers or activators, if you prefer that word. So is it with certain people that they spend time with? Is it certain environments? Is it when they've been feeling a certain way? So is it when they're very, very tired? Or is it when something's happened at school? Like if they are being bullied, is it always after that? Is it a certain day of the week or month of the year? Is it a certain time of day? And is it when they are experiencing other things? In which case, can they foresee that and try and avoid it? Early warning signs are really encouraging people to notice signs in their body that they're actually becoming stressed. And this is really useful as a self-care thing for parents and carers as well. So what people can do is maybe imagine a relatively low type of stress for them, something that's not going to activate a big stress response, and notice where top to toe, all the way through the body, where that stress is being felt. So is it any changes in the skin or any muscle changes? Is it around the body movements that we're having? Is it about anything we feel inside our bodies, our breathing, our heart rate, etc.? So once we become the experts in our very early warning signs of stress, we can start to navigate a different path to ending up feeling completely hijacked by that stress. So as I say, that's very useful for the young person or child who's self-harming, but also people around them who might need to bring in extra well-being strategies for themselves over this period of time. Other resources might be that, for example, a thought journal. So somebody writes down some of the negative thinking that they've been having and start to actually actively interrupt that negative thinking and replacing some of those negative thoughts by evidence-based thoughts rather than always thinking that they're not good enough, but with no evidence, for example. Another resource is something called the stress bucket. And if you use the search engine, you'll find lots of examples of a diagram of a stress bucket where people can, in any way, using stickers or drawings or words, fill the bucket with all the things that they are worried about or that are impacting them. And that might be in their household, in their school or college or work, in the community, or even globally. And once they've worked out all the things that are creating the stress, they then might understand a bit more why they are feeling so stressed at the moment, and the overflow of the stress is the behavior that comes from the stress. So that might be self-harm, it might be disordered eating, it might be taking more substances and things like that. So we might have examples of how to mitigate that stress which are healthy, and ways of mitigating that stress that feel okay initially but then actually create more problems. So that's a really good way of writing down some of the alternative choices that people might be able to have, and also to explain why it is often the harmful behaviours that we go to, because they feel very immediate. They can be very rewarding initially, but actually they then create more problems along the line. And talking about what happens next can be a really good motivator for people to reduce or stop their harming. So things like having a wound longer term that other people can see or that actually hurts, is not so motivating, or having a scar that might last and last. Young people sometimes talk about stopping their harming because they realize that they don't want scars going forward, and they don't want to have to explain that to people when they're older. And although it might seem quite direct, if it's done gently and when the young person is ready, it can be a very useful conversation to have. Also, we talked about network for parents and carers. There also are networks that can be set up for the young person. Obviously, it depends on where people live and what services there are locally. There are national services as well that can be accessed online, via helplines, or via national charities. So again, please use the links at the end of the webinar that will take you through to lots of examples of organisations and groups that support specifically with self-harm. The last point on this slide is time, partly because it's very difficult to know how long it's going to take for somebody to recover from their emotional distress and or the behaviour that's coming from that emotional distress. What we're focusing, of course, today on is self-harm. And as we mentioned, if it's low risk, then it's always better to have a young person set their own pace so they don't feel that they become even more overwhelmed by the recovery process, but also that we are all patient and understand that things can speed up and slow down when it comes to recovery. So that's a very difficult thing to accept, but if we expect the time to vary in the pace of a recovery, then we are more likely to manage it if that actually happens. A very practical step might be to develop a safety plan with the young person. It really helps if they're very willing to do that and very self-motivated to do it as well. It depends on the level of risk, what sort of information you might have on the safety plan. And obviously it depends on the timing as well of the incident and the conversation you might be having with the young person. But longer term, it tends to be something that can work in stages if it's low risk, so that somebody doesn't feel overwhelmed by thinking it through and what they might be able to do if they notice that they are activated or triggered to a stress reaction, which might then lead to self-harm. You'll see on this example that there are ways of sort of working out what context and what feelings might be a precursor to self-harm, and some strategies that we used on the previous slide. Any of those that work for that young person could be noted down there. The people that they might reach out to and how they would reach out to them, and that's a really good opportunity to set boundaries that work for everybody as well. And also just grounding techniques and activities that might help somebody who is avoiding getting activated to the point of wanting to self-harm. Other resources might be an opportunity to look through apps, also websites, videos and things like that that are all signposted at the end of this presentation. And it might be an opportunity as well to go through with somebody how to make that call or to send that crisis text. It's a good idea to sit down and do that with them so that they don't feel so overwhelmed in doing that, making that very difficult step if they're really stressed. Also, it's a good idea to do that co-regulation grounding technique with them as well, so you can model it, and it also helps the person who's with them to stay as calm as possible as well. The SMARTER goal model is quite useful in this situation, so that's goals that are specific, measurable, achievable actions, realistic, time limited, evaluated and reviewed. And that encourages us also to check in with them from time to time, though it might be a good idea to agree that so the young person doesn't feel like we're going to bring it up at any point and when they're not ready to talk about it again. So now we'll turn to summarising and consolidating a little bit the approaches that tend to work better and approaches that have seemed to not work so well. And this has been taken from feedback from families and young people who have been in recovery from self-harm behaviours. So on the left there, we've got what works. So initially, just like to encourage people to take stock before they knock and to just try and notice the bigger picture around the young person, and to see the self-harm as a coping strategy that is probably fueled by something that we can't see and maybe that they don't know about and they don't know how to express. And the next point is to listen. And active listening is a very difficult skill, but it's a very important skill when it comes to emotional health. And with young people, often what they perceive is that adults maybe don't hear or see or understand what's going on with them. But actually, when there's an atmosphere of sharing that's listened to and validated, then they might feel a little bit more that they have the space to express themselves. That's also the opportunity there to interrupt the automatic response, which, as we said, is really understandable and natural. We might go into fight mode, which when we might be quite angry and maybe chastising and scornful of the young person who's creating this injury, but also to go into flight mode when we might want to avoid it or diminish it. We might go into freeze where we don't know what to do, or flop when we feel really down and upset, or friendship mode when we try and befriend or maybe sort of scoop somebody up a little bit more maybe than they need. So all of those things are completely normal. But if we notice those things, we'll probably be able to reduce them so that we can actually be in a space where we can listen to the person who's really struggling and asking, maybe indirectly asking for help. The next point is to try and accept that this young person is harming themselves because of the stigma and the taboo and the shame attached to self-harm. It is a very difficult thing to accept for the young person and for the people looking after them or who are their parents and carers. So accepting that this is happening is a really, really difficult thing to do. It's a really important part of that teamwork that can come from it. The next point is responding. So really what we say and what we don't say. Very important point is to validate that somebody is struggling. We might not know exactly, and they might not know exactly what they're struggling with, but even to say something like, it seems like you're really struggling at the moment is an incredibly generous thing to say. And even if we can't fix it, or we don't know what to do yet, or we might be panicking a little bit somewhere in our bodies, if we can say something like that, it connects us to that other young person, and they're more likely to come back to us for help in the future and in the longer run. Being alongside and being in a team can feel very difficult, especially if we're in fight mode ourselves and they might be in fight response themselves as well, maybe from the nervousness of disclosing or from us finding out that they're harming themselves. Sometimes a young person might just leave a clue. They might leave evidence that they've been harming themselves or clues that they've been harming themselves in the vicinity of their room or in the home or in their pencil case, and if we've spotted it, then it might be that they're waiting for us to broach the subject. And one of the things we can say is, I just want to be in a team with you. I just want to be there with you, even if I don't know what the answers to all this are at the moment. The next point is that collaboration. So focusing on the team, focusing on what we can do together, agreeing the goals, agreeing the boundaries for everybody so everyone can stay well as possible in the situation, and also to focus on the strengths. So to help a young person to see what they're good at, to share some of our own things that we're proud of themselves, to model that kind of language to a young person. The openness might be that we do tell them that we don't know what to do and that we're frightened, depending on the age and the language ability of the young person, depending on what they can process. Might be a good opportunity to say, I don't have all the answers, but I'd like to help us both find out the answers and to try and get a plan together. And the next one is to follow up on it. So not to avoid that flight mode where we might just hope for the best that it's not going to happen again. And it may well be a one-off incident that very low risk and never happens again. But it's really important that we check in with that young person again, that we warn them that we're going to talk about it, and then to find a safe space we're both ready to talk about it, and just to check in with them. Things that don't work so much are definitely ignoring it and hoping it'll go away, being in reaction mode, we can for a while, but it's good to clear that up and maybe just say, look, you know, I've reacted, but I'd like to actually be there with you. Staying in reaction mode and never coming out of it tends to put somebody off from sharing what they're going through. Resisting it and sort of trying to control it ourselves, taking over and not giving the young person any power of what's going on, though of course that depends on risk level, so that we can't talk about individual cases in this webinar. And if you've got advice to do things that are not consented to by the young person, then please follow that advice from specialists if you're working with them. Going solo, so try not to take this on your own. You probably will need support yourself. So please try and get your own network. And breaking trust, so that's about the consent that we talked about with the young person. If we haven't told the young person we have to share the information, it's likely that they won't talk to us again. So that's true with a professional, but it's also true with family members and friends. So if we do have to share information, then it's really important that we explain why, and if possible, let that person choose whether that's can happen or not, and how it happens. So if we have to tell somebody else, we might just be able to involve them in the way we share that information. Here are the links that we promised you at the end of the webinar that would signpost you to all the other resources that we mentioned. We've only had time to go through some of the basics, particularly for the strategies for recovery. So the following points might help you. Please go at your own pace, but when you've got time and when you feel like it might be worth having a look at the first one, which is the Mind main page on self-harm, and then the one underneath, which is our parenting support, which will signpost you and explain what West Sussex Mind specifically do for parents and carers. And then there's a short video on what West Sussex Mind work and how they work and what they do. And the final link there is Self-Harm Resources e-Wellbeing. So that's provided by the YMCA Downslink group and is an enormous resources page specifically for self-harm support and recovery, and will signpost through pages which are designed for parents and carers, a whole other page for professionals, and a whole other page for young people and children themselves. So there is no end of resources on those pages and links to other training modules, presentations, resources, websites, helplines, and things like that. So please do look as and when you have time to do that. And as a final note, just to please remember that you are doing the best you can in the context you're in. And your young person or child is also doing the best they can in whichever context that they are in. That recovery is possible, even though it does vary in time frame and the shape and form it takes from person to person. And also that neither you nor your child or young person are alone. Self-harm can affect, we think, 1 in 10 young people in its various shapes and forms. It's very rarely talked about. Awareness is increasing and support is increasing. So we can all be part of that so that self-harm doesn't continue for somebody when they are wanting to stop or reduce it. Thank you very much.